Have you ever stood in the center of your own living room, surrounded by the silent wreckage of your own expectations, and felt a quiet, terrifying certainty that there was absolutely no point to any of it? I don't mean the kind of bad day where you spill your coffee or get a flat tire. I'm talking about that heavy, suffocating fog that settles over your soul when you look back at the last decade of your life, and all you see is a series of jagged, disconnected lines that lead nowhere. That was me. I was standing there, gripping a lukewarm mug of tea that I didn't even want, staring out at a gray, rainy Tuesday afternoon that looked exactly like how I felt inside. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful. It was accusatory. It seemed to scream at me that I was 42 years old, alone, financially unstable, and spiritually bankrupt. The narrative I had written for myself, the one where by this age I would be settled, successful, and surrounded by a loving family, had been burned to ash years ago. And what replaced it wasn't a new story. It was just chaos. It was a scribbled mess of unfinished chapters, plot holes, and tragic twists that felt cruel and unnecessary. For years, I had been told that God is a God of order. I heard the sermons. I memorized the verses. For I know the plans I have for you, the famous verse from Jeremiah. People love to quote that when you lose your job, or when your marriage falls apart, or when the medical diagnosis comes back with words you can't pronounce. They smile these soft, pitying smiles and say, it's all part of the plan. But standing there that Tuesday, looking at the stack of unpaid medical bills on the counter and feeling the phantom ache of a relationship that had ended 3 years ago without closure, I didn't feel like part of a plan. I felt like the rough draft that the author had crumbled up and thrown into the wastebasket. Nothing made sense. The math of my life didn't add up. I had tried to be good. I had tried to be faithful. I had tithed when I had no money. I had served when I had no energy. And I had prayed until my throat was raw. And yet here I was, in a house that felt too big and too small at the same time, drowning in a confusion so deep it felt physical. I remember walking over to the window and pressing my forehead against the cold glass. The condensation chilled my skin, a stark contrast to the heat of the anger rising in my chest. It wasn't a fiery, explosive rage. It was a cold, hard bitterness. I started to retrace my steps, trying to find the exact moment where the plot was lost. Was it when the business failed? I had poured every cent of my savings into that bakery, believing, truly believing, that God had given me the vision. I prayed over the lease. I prayed over the ovens. I prayed over the first batch of dough, and it failed. Not spectacularly, but slowly, painfully, bleeding me dry over 2 years until I had to lock the doors with a debt that still followed me like a shadow. Or was it before that? Was it the miscarriage? That was the chapter I usually skipped over in my mind because the pages were too stained with tears to read. We had named him Samuel, heard by God, but when we lost him, it felt like God had gone deaf. That loss was the hairline fracture that eventually shattered my marriage. My husband, a good man who just didn't know how to grieve, drifted away into work, and I drifted into a fortress of silence until we were just two strangers sharing a zip code. Why? The question hammered against my skull. Why give me the dream of the bakery if it was going to bankrupt me? Why give me the joy of pregnancy if it was going to end in a sterile hospital room with a nurse saying, "I'm so sorry"? Why allow me to have a heart that desires connection so deeply, only to leave me in this profound isolation? If this was a story, the writer was incompetent, or worse, the writer was cruel. That was the thought that scared me the most. I could handle a chaotic world if God was distant, but the idea that God was present, that he was holding the pen, and he was actively choosing to write this much pain into my character arc, that felt like a betrayal I couldn't forgive. I looked at the Bible sitting on the coffee table. It was dusty. I hadn't opened it in months because every time I did, the promises felt like taunts. All things work together for good. Really? How does the foreclosure notice work for good? How does the empty nursery work for good? How does the depression that makes it hard to get out of bed in the morning work for good? I wanted to scream, but I was too tired. So, I just whispered. I whispered to the rain, to the empty room, to the God I wasn't sure was listening. I don't get it. I just don't get it. I felt like I was walking through a labyrinth in the dark, bumping into walls, turning corners only to find dead ends while someone watched from above, refusing to turn on the lights. It wasn't just that I was suffering. It was that the suffering felt random. It felt like bad luck. It felt like I had slipped through the cracks of the universe and been forgotten. I thought about the people I went to college with. I saw their highlight reels on social media, the promotions, the vacations, the smiling children with straight teeth, the anniversary dinners. Their stories seemed to have a linear progression: introduction, rising action, success, happiness. My story felt like a tragedy written in a foreign language. That afternoon, the darkness in the room grew heavier as the sun set behind the storm clouds. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat on the floor, pulling my knees to my chest, feeling small. I was 7 years old again, hiding in the closet because I was afraid of the thunder, waiting for my dad to come open the door and tell me it was okay. But no one was coming to open the door. I was the adult now. I was supposed to be the one with the answers. And that's when the tears finally came. Not the polite crying you do at funerals. This was ugly, guttural weeping. It was the sound of a soul dismantling itself. I cried for the bakery. I cried for Samuel. I cried for my marriage. But mostly, I cried for the death of my certainty. I mourned the loss of the simple faith I used to have, the kind that believed if you did A and B, God would do C. That equation was broken. I didn't know it then, huddled on the floor in the dark, but I was at the pivot point. In every great story, there is a moment called the all is lost moment. It's where the hero has exhausted all their resources, all their plans have failed, and they are forced to confront their greatest fear. I was there. I was staring into the abyss of meaninglessness. I was ready to close the book. I was ready to say, the end, and settle for a life of numb survival. I didn't want to hope anymore, because hope was the thing that hurt the most. Hope was the weapon that had been used against me. If I didn't hope, I couldn't be disappointed. If I didn't expect the plot to twist, I wouldn't be devastated when it went straight off a cliff. But as I sat there, letting the silence wash over me, a strange thing happened. My eyes adjusted to the dark. And in that darkness, amidst the rubble of my deconstructed life, a single intrusive thought pushed its way through the noise of my sobbing. It wasn't a voice from heaven. It wasn't a burning bush. It was just a memory. A memory of a tapestry I had seen once in a museum when I was a child. I remembered looking at the back of it, a chaotic mess of knots, frayed threads, and ugly hanging yarns that made no picture at all. And I remembered the guide telling me, "You're looking at the wrong side." I closed my eyes and let that image of the tapestry hover in the darkness of my mind. It was such a distinct memory, smelling of old dust and floor wax from that field trip 30 years ago. The back of that weaving was hideous. It was a chaotic jumble of knots where threads had been tied off and cut. There were long, dangling strings that looked like mistakes. The colors clashed violently. Dark purples strangled by jarring neon yellows, deep blacks overwhelming soft pinks. There was no pattern. There was no beauty. It looked like an accident. It looked like vandalism. I remembered standing there as a little girl, wrinkling my nose, thinking the artist had done a terrible job. But then, the guide had gently turned me around. She walked me to the front of the loom, and the gasp that escaped my lips back then echoed in my spirit now. The front wasn't a mess. It was a masterpiece. It was a breathtaking landscape of a storm breaking over a mountain, with sunbeams piercing through the clouds. The dark, ugly black threads on the back? They were the shadows that gave the mountain depth. The jarring yellow knots? They were the brilliant highlights of the sun. The cut strings? They were necessary endings to start new colors. Every single chaotic element on the back was absolutely essential to the beauty on the front. Sitting on my living room floor, a chill went through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. I looked at the black threads of my life again. I looked at the bakery. For 2 years, I had viewed that failure as the ultimate evidence of my incompetence and God's indifference. I had labeled that chapter, the mistake. But for the first time, I tried to walk around to the front of the loom. I forced myself to look at the details I had been ignoring in my bitterness. I thought about the last month the bakery was open. I was drowning in debt, yes. But because I couldn't afford staff anymore, I had to work the front counter myself every single morning. I was exhausted, humiliated, serving coffee to people who looked at me with pity. But there was that one regular, Mr. Henderson, an 80-year-old man who came in every day for a plain croissant. We started talking because I had no one else to talk to. He told me about his wife, about his life in marketing, about how he felt invisible. One morning, right before I closed the doors for good, he handed me a business card for a marketing firm. He said, "You have a gift for storytelling, my dear. You sold me a croissant, but you made me feel like I was in Paris. If this doesn't work out, call this number. My son runs the place." I had thrown that card in a drawer and forgotten it. I was too proud to work for someone else. I was a business owner, not a copywriter. But now in the dark, I realized something terrifyingly specific. The bakery had to fail. If the bakery had succeeded, I would still be waking up at 3 a.m. to knead dough, destroying my back, trapped in a kitchen, exhausted and isolated. I would never have met Mr. Henderson. I would never have received that card. And looking at my bank account now, I realized the only reason I had survived the last 6 months of unemployment was because I picked up a few freelance writing gigs. Gigs I only got because I eventually swallowed my pride and called that number. The bakery wasn't a failed destination. It was a very expensive, very painful corridor. It was the only way to get me to the place where I actually belonged. The black thread of bankruptcy was being woven into a gold thread of a new vocation I hadn't even known I wanted. My heart started beating faster. If the bakery wasn't a mistake, what else wasn't a mistake? I turned my attention to the divorce. That wound was still fresh, a jagged red tear in the fabric of my soul. How could that possibly be part of a perfect story? My husband leaving me felt like an amputation, but I forced myself to be honest, really honest, for the first time. I looked at who I was in that marriage. I was a chameleon. I had spent 10 years making myself smaller to fit into his world. I had stopped writing. I had stopped singing. I had stopped seeing my friends because he didn't like them. I had made him my sun, and I was just a pale moon reflecting his light. I had idolized the status of being married more than I had honored the sanctity of my own soul. When he left, I felt like I had died. But as I sat there, I realized I was breathing. I was alone, yes, but the air I was breathing was my own. In the silence of the last 3 years, that terrible silence I had hated, I had started to hear my own voice again. I remembered the journals I had filled in the last few months, pages and pages of raw, honest prayer. I hadn't written like that in a decade. If he had stayed, I would still be that shell of a woman, smiling at dinner parties while dying inside, playing a role in a story that wasn't mine. His departure was cruel, yes. The betrayal was a sin, yes. God didn't orchestrate the sin, but he certainly used the exit. He used the breaking of my heart to break the chains I didn't even know I was wearing. The red thread of divorce was the color of blood, yes, but it was also the color of a heart starting to beat for itself again. It was a rescue operation disguised as a tragedy. I was grieving a disruption, but God was orchestrating a divine intervention. I had been begging God to save my marriage, but he loved me too much to answer that prayer with a yes. Instead, he answered with a no that saved me. I stood up. The pins and needles in my legs were sharp, but I barely felt them. The room was pitch black now, but inside my head, a light was flickering on. It was a tentative, fragile light, but it was there. I started pacing the room. What about the timing? That was the thing that always angered me the most. The delays, the waiting, the endless, silent waiting. Why did I have to wait 5 years for the business to launch, only to see it fail? Why did I have to wait until 42 to find myself single again? It felt like wasted time. It felt like God was dragging his feet. But then I thought about the conversation I had with my sister just last week. She was going through a crisis with her teenage daughter, a crisis involving depression and self-harm. I had listened to her cry on the phone, and I found myself speaking words of comfort and wisdom that shocked me. I told her things about resilience, about hitting rock bottom, about finding light in the dark. Where had those words come from? They came from my pain, They came from the bakery failure. They came from the miscarriage. They came from the divorce. I was able to be a pillar of strength for her only because I had been forged in the fire of my own suffering. If my life had gone according to my plan, the linear, successful, happy plan, I would have been useless to her. I would have offered her cliches and empty platitudes. Just pray about it, I would have said dismissively. But because I had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, I could actually hold her hand while she walked through hers. My wasted time was actually my seminary. My suffering was my credential. The delays weren't empty waiting rooms. They were classrooms. God wasn't ignoring me. He was equipping me. He was loading me with the heavy ammunition of empathy and wisdom because he knew there were battles coming. Not just my battles, but the battles of the people he needed me to help. That required a soldier, not a civilian. I walked into the kitchen and flipped on the light switch. The sudden brightness stung my eyes. I looked around at the messy counters, the pile of mail, the empty chair. Nothing in the room had changed. The circumstances were exactly the same as they had been an hour ago. I was still broke. I was still single. I was still uncertain about the future. But everything had changed because the lens had changed. I wasn't looking at a pile of unrelated tragedies anymore. I was looking at the back of a tapestry. I couldn't see the picture yet, not fully. I couldn't see the mountain or the sunbeams. But for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that there was a front side. I allowed myself to consider the possibility that the weaver knew exactly what he was doing with the black threads and the red threads and the knots. I picked up the Bible from the table. I blew off the dust. I didn't open it to a random page this time. I opened it with a purpose. I wanted to see if this pattern held up. I wanted to see if this was just a coping mechanism I had invented to make myself feel better, or if this was actually how God operated. I started flipping through the pages, looking for the characters I had glossed over. I looked for the failures. I looked for the delays. I looked for the messes. And what I found there, in those ancient pages, stopped my breath. I realized I wasn't the first person to stand in the middle of a wreckage and think the story was over. In fact, it seemed that being in the wreckage was the prerequisite for the miracle. I realized that in God's economy, the all is lost moment isn't the end of the book. It's usually the beginning of chapter 1. I turned the pages to Genesis, my fingers trembling slightly as they found the story of Joseph. I had heard this story since I was in diapers. I knew the flannel graph version, the colorful coat, the jealous brothers, the pit, the prison, and then, ta-da, the palace. It was always presented as a neat, tidy trajectory, from the pit to the palace, as if it were a direct flight with a minor layover. But sitting there in my kitchen, with the residue of my own tears still drying on my cheeks, I didn't read it like a Sunday school lesson. I read it like a diary of a man who was living a nightmare. I slowed down. I forced myself to stop skimming over the verses that detailed the suffering. I looked at the timeline. Joseph was 17 when he was sold into slavery. 17. He was a child. He had dreams from God, literal, vivid dreams of greatness and authority. And what was God's immediate response to those dreams? A pit, a caravan of slave traders, a foreign country where he didn't speak the language. I tried to imagine the terrified teenage boy, chained, walking miles in the desert heat, looking up at the same moon I was looking at, asking, God, I thought you showed me I was going to be a ruler. Why am I a slave? I read on. He gets to Potiphar's house. He works hard. He does everything right. He keeps his integrity. And what is his reward for being righteous? He gets falsely accused of rape and thrown into a dungeon. This is where I stopped and put the book down on the table, breathing hard. This was the part that always messed me up. If you do good, you get good, right? That's the unspoken contract we think we have with God. But Joseph did good. He ran from sin, and he got a prison sentence. And he stayed there, not for a weekend, not for a month, for years. The Bible says, and Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison. And then, later, after he interprets the cupbearer's dream, the text delivers one of the most crushing sentences in Scripture. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. 2 more full years. I closed my eyes and tried to feel the weight of those 2 years. 2 years of waking up on a stone floor, 2 years of smelling rot and despair, 2 years of wondering if the dreams were just hallucinations. If I could have interviewed Joseph in that cell during year 1, day 300, what would he have said? Would he have said, "Don't worry, it's all part of the plan"? I doubt it. I think he would have said, "I am forgotten. My life is over. God has tricked me." He couldn't see the famine that was coming decades later. He couldn't see that this prison was the only place where he could meet the people who would eventually introduce him to Pharaoh. He couldn't see that the administrative skills he was learning by organizing the prison were the exact skills he would need to organize the entire economy of Egypt and save the known world from starvation. He just saw bars. He just saw a dead end. And yet, the text says, "The Lord was with Joseph. God was with him in the pit. God was with him in the prison." The presence of pain did not mean the absence of God. That was a radical thought for me. I had always equated God's presence with comfort. If I was comfortable, God was near. If I was suffering, God was far. But Joseph's story shattered that theology. God was writing the story in the dark. I flipped forward. I went to Moses, another giant of the faith. We remember the Red Sea parting. We remember the burning bush. But we forget the 40 years of silence in the middle. Moses tried to save his people in his own strength, committed a murder, and ran for his life. He went from being a prince of Egypt, educated in the finest schools, destined for power, to being a shepherd in the backside of the desert. For 40 years, that is an entire lifetime. He spent 4 decades staring at the rear end of sheep, smelling like manure, living in a tent, probably thinking every single day, "I blew it. I had a destiny, and I ruined it. I am a has-been." He was 80 years old when the burning bush happened. 80! Most people are wrapping up their lives at 80, and God was just getting started. Why the wait? Why the waste? I realized, reading it now, that the 40 years weren't wasted. The Moses who killed the Egyptian was arrogant and impulsive. He thought he could liberate a nation with his sword. He wasn't ready. The Moses who came out of the desert 40 years later was humble. He was hesitant. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He had learned patience. You have to be patient to deal with sheep, and he was about to lead a nation of people who acted exactly like sheep. The desert broke him of his self-reliance so that he could be filled with God-reliance. The delay wasn't a denial. The delay was the development. God couldn't use the prince. He had to use the shepherd. And the only way to make a shepherd out of a prince was 40 years of obscurity. I looked at my own wasted years, my failed business, my quiet, lonely house. Was it possible that I wasn't on a shelf? Was it possible I was in the pasture? Was it possible that God wasn't punishing me, but preparing me for something so heavy that the version of me from 5 years ago would have been crushed under its weight? Then I thought about David, anointed by the prophet Samuel to be king when he was just a teenager. Oil runs down his head. The promise is given. You are the king. So does he get the crown the next day? No. He gets a spear thrown at his head by the current king. He spends roughly 15 years running for his life, hiding in caves, pretending to be a madman, sleeping in the dirt, surrounded by a ragtag group of outcasts. Imagine the cognitive dissonance. God, you said I am king, but I am living like a criminal. Did I hear you wrong? Did the prophet lie? I could hear David's desperation in the Psalms. How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? He wasn't reciting poetry. He was screaming into the void. But in those caves, David learned how to lead men who were broken. He learned how to depend on God when he had no food and no protection. He wrote the songs that would comfort billions of people for thousands of years. If David had gone straight from the sheep pen to the throne, he would have been a tyrant like Saul. The caves carved out the soul of the king. The pattern was undeniable. It was terrifying, but it was undeniable. In every single story of a person God used mightily, there was a period, a long, agonizing, confusing period, where it looked like the plan had failed. There was always a middle, and the middle always looked like a disaster. It looked like slavery. It looked like a desert. It looked like a cave. It looked like a cross on a Friday, with the disciples hiding in fear, thinking the Messiah was dead and the movement was over. They didn't know Sunday was coming. They just knew Saturday hurt. And I realized, with a jolt that sat me straight up in my chair, that I was living in a Saturday. I was living in the cave. I was in the prison cell. I had been judging my entire existence based on the middle of the book, convinced it was the ending. I had been crying the end when God was simply turning the page to the next chapter of character development. The why began to shift. It wasn't, why is this happening to me anymore? It was, what are you making out of me? If the bakery failure was my prison, what administrative skill was I learning? If the divorce was my desert, what dependence was I learning? If the silence was my cave, what song was being written in my heart? I wasn't a victim of random chaos. I was a student in the most intense university of the soul. The author hadn't lost the plot. He was building the tension. He was deepening the conflict because the greater the conflict, the more glorious the resolution. A story without a problem is a boring story. A life without a struggle is a shallow life. I looked at the Bible, closed it gently, and whispered, okay, I'm in the middle. It hurts, it sucks, but I'm not lost. But realizing you are in the story is one thing. Accepting the pen is another. I knew that my perspective had shifted, but my reality was still hard. I still had bills. I still had loneliness. The theology was sound, but the application was going to be the hardest thing I had ever done. I needed to stop fighting the plot and start cooperating with the author. I needed to find out how to live in the middle without losing my mind. And that meant I had to stop looking at the closed doors with regret and start looking for the windows I hadn't noticed before. It meant I had to trust the silence. And just as that thought settled in, just as I felt a tiny seed of peace take root, my phone buzzed on the table, a single vibration that shattered the silence of the room. I looked at the screen. It was a number I didn't recognize. At 9 p.m. on a Tuesday. Normally, I would ignore it, but something, maybe the Joseph story, maybe the adrenaline of my realization, made me reach out and slide the button to answer. Hello, I said, my voice still thick from crying. The voice on the other end was hesitant, female, and sounded vaguely familiar. Hi, is this Sarah? This is Emily, from the bakery. I know it's been 2 years, and this is weird, but can I talk to you? I think I made a huge mistake, and you're the only person who might understand. The plot was twisting again, and this time, I was ready to listen. I held the phone against my ear, the plastic warm against my cheek, my heart thudding a strange rhythm against my ribs. Emily. I remembered her instantly. She wasn't just from the bakery. She had been my first hire, a 19-year-old art student with neon blue hair and paint-stained fingernails who made latte art that looked like Van Gogh paintings. She was vibrant, chaotic, and brilliant. But 6 months before the bakery closed, she had quit suddenly. No 2-week notice, just a scribbled note left by the espresso machine saying she had met a guy and was moving to the West Coast to find herself. I hadn't heard from her since. And now, here she was, a ghost from my failed chapter, calling me out of the blue on the very night I was wrestling with the meaning of that failure. Emily, I asked, my voice steadying. I'm here. What's wrong? Her voice cracked. I remembered what you told me once, about the storm. Do you remember? It was that day the power went out, and we were sitting on the floor in the dark, waiting for the repair guy. I didn't remember, not specifically. There had been so many crises in that bakery, but I stayed silent, letting her speak. You told me that storms don't last forever, but they change the landscape forever, and that the change isn't always bad. It just means you have to learn to navigate a new map. She took a ragged breath. Sarah, I'm back in town. I came back 3 days ago. The guy, it was bad, really bad. I lost everything. My confidence, my art, my money. I'm sleeping on my mom's couch, and I feel like I've ruined my life before it even started. I found your number in my old contacts, and I didn't know who else to call. Everyone else just tells me, I told you so. But I knew you wouldn't. I sat there stunned. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. Here was this young woman, echoing the exact sentiments I had been screaming at the ceiling an hour ago. ruined, lost, hopeless. And she was calling me? The woman who had just been weeping on the floor about her own uselessness? "Sarah," she whispered, terrified by my silence. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have called." "No," I said quickly, the word rushing out with a force that surprised me. "No, Emily, you called the exact right person." And in that moment, the black thread of my bakery failure suddenly snapped into a new pattern. If the bakery hadn't happened, if I hadn't hired her, if I hadn't spent those long, slow afternoons talking to her about life and art and faith while we wiped down counters, she wouldn't be calling me now. The business had failed financially, yes, but the ministry of that business was apparently still bearing fruit 2 years later. The seeds I had planted in the soil of that mistake were sprouting in the dark. "Where are you?" I asked. "I'm coming to pick you up. We're going to get coffee, the cheap kind, from the diner that's open all night." 2 hours later, I was sitting in a vinyl booth across from Emily. She looked older, thinner, the spark in her eyes dimmed by whatever trauma she had endured out west. She talked for an hour, pouring out a story of emotional abuse, manipulation, and shattered dreams. It was a heavy story, a dark story. And as I listened, I realized something profound. I wasn't listening with the ears of a judge. I wasn't listening with the ears of a fixer who wanted to offer quick solutions. I was listening with the ears of a fellow traveler. Every time she described the feeling of hitting a wall, I nodded, because I knew the texture of that wall. Every time she described the shame of starting over, I squeezed her hand, because I was wearing that same shame like a coat. My suffering had dug a reservoir of empathy in my soul, deep enough to hold her pain without overflowing. "I just don't know what to do next." She wiped her eyes with a napkin. "I used to want to paint. Now I can't even look at a canvas. It feels pointless." I looked at her, and I didn't give her a platitude. I didn't tell her God has a plan, even though I knew He did. Instead, I told her about the tapestry. I told her about my Tuesday night. I told her about Joseph in the prison. I told her, "Emily, right now you are staring at the knots, and they are ugly. I'm not going to lie to you and say they are pretty. They are ugly knots. But you are not the weaver. You are the canvas, and the weaver isn't done." She looked at me, her eyes wide. "But I wasted 3 years," she whispered. "No," I said firmly, feeling the truth of it burn in my own chest as I spoke it to her. "You didn't waste them. You survived them. And the Emily who survived is stronger, deeper, and more complex than the Emily who left. You have more colors to paint with now. Before, you only had bright yellows and blues. Now? Now you have the deep purples of sorrow. You have the grays of resilience. You have the blacks of grief. Your art won't be the same. No, it will be better. Because it will be true." A tiny flicker of hope sparked in her eyes. It was faint, but it was there. "You really think so?" "I know so," I said, "because nothing is wasted. Not a single tear, not a single mistake. God is a master of recycling. He takes the debris of our lives and builds bridges." As I drove her home later that night, the rain had stopped. The streets were slick and black, reflecting the streetlights like diamonds scattered on velvet. I felt exhausted, but it was a good exhaustion. It was the exhaustion of purpose. I hadn't solved my financial problems. I hadn't fixed my loneliness. But for 3 hours, I had stepped out of my own narrative of self-pity and stepped into someone else's story. And in doing so, I had found my own footing. I realized that my pain was a key that unlocked the cages of other people. If I hadn't been broken, I couldn't have connected with Emily. My brokenness was the bridge. I got home and walked back into the living room. It felt different now. The silence wasn't accusatory anymore. It was expectant. I went to my desk, the desk covered in unpaid bills and rejection letters from publishers, and I sat down. I pushed the bills aside. I opened my laptop. The screen glowed white in the dark room. I opened a blank document. For 3 years, I had been trying to write a bestseller. I had been trying to write what I thought the market wanted: romance novels, mystery thrillers, things that would sell. I had been writing from my head, trying to manufacture success. But tonight, I didn't care about selling. I cared about saying something true. I typed a title: The Gift of the Knot, Finding Purpose When Life Unravels. And then I started to type. I didn't type fiction. I typed the truth. I wrote about the bakery. I wrote about the baby. I wrote about the divorce. I wrote about the screaming on the floor. I wrote about the tapestry. The words didn't trickle. They flooded. It was as if a dam had broken. I wrote for 4 hours straight until the sun started to bleed gray light into the sky. I wasn't writing for an audience of millions. I was writing for Emily. I was writing for the version of myself that was on the floor 5 hours ago. I was writing for every person who felt like they were in the middle of a tragedy and couldn't see the end. When I finally stopped, my fingers ached. I had written 3 chapters. I read them over, and I cried. Not tears of despair this time, but tears of recognition. I saw myself on the page, and I saw God on the page. He was there in the white spaces between the words. He was there in the vulnerability. I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't writing to impress anyone. I was writing to bleed. And there is a power in blood that ink can never replicate. I didn't know it then, but that manuscript, started in the deepest valley of my life, wouldn't just sit on my hard drive. I didn't know that 6 months later, I would send it to a small publisher, fully expecting a rejection, only to get a call 10 minutes after the editor read it. I didn't know that the editor had just lost her husband and that my words had been the lifeline she needed that morning. I didn't know that the book would go on to sell, not millions, but enough to pay off the bakery debt, enough to give me a new career. But even if I had known, it wouldn't have mattered as much as the feeling I had right then, watching the sunrise. Because as the sun came up, painting the sky in violent purples and soft oranges, I saw the physical manifestation of what I had learned. The sunrise is only beautiful because of the contrast between the light and the remaining dark. If it was all light, you'd be blinded. If it was all dark, you'd be lost. But the transition, the middle, that's where the glory is. That's where the colors are. I made a pot of coffee. I sat on my porch, and I prayed. A simple prayer. Okay, God, you have the pen. I'm sorry I tried to grab it from you. I'm sorry I critiqued the plot before the book was done. I trust you with the scary chapters. I trust you with the sad chapters. Just keep writing and use me. Whatever this is, use it. I took a sip of coffee. It tasted better than it had in years. I wasn't fixed. My life wasn't perfect, but it was meaningful. And meaning is a far stronger shelter than happiness ever could be. I thought the story was over because the scene was dark. But I was learning that the darkness is just the setting for the stars to finally shine. I was ready for the next scene. I was ready for the plot twist. Little did I know, the biggest twist wasn't the book. It wasn't the career. It was who I was about to meet at the post office when I went to mail that first manuscript. It was a divine collision that would make me laugh at my own doubt. God has a sense of humor, and he loves a callback. The post office was busy that Thursday morning, smelling faintly of paper dust and anxiety. I stood in line, clutching the heavy manila envelope containing my manuscript, the gift of the knot. Mailing it felt like pushing a ship off the shore. It was the physical act of surrender. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for a sign. I was acting on faith, putting the raw, vulnerable story of my pain out into the world with no expectation of return. It was terrifying. It felt like sending my heart to the mercy of strangers. The weight of the envelope seemed immense, carrying the history of the bakery, the loss of Samuel, the quiet agony of the divorce. I was so lost in the finality of the moment that I almost didn't notice the commotion when the man in front of me shifted his large box and a cascade of blueprints spilled onto the slick tile floor. He was tall, maybe mid-40s, wearing a gray, slightly rumpled tweed jacket and glasses perched on his nose. He had the tired, focused look of someone who spent more time thinking than sleeping. As he bent down, scrambling to gather the rolled papers, one of them skittered right to my feet. I picked it up. It was a complex architectural drawing, full of lines and angles. On the corner, stamped in severe black ink, was the title, Structural Rehabilitation Plan, Old Mill Redevelopment. "Oh, thank you," he said, standing up, his eyes meeting mine. They were a startling, clear green. "I swear the moment you need a hand, you realize you have zero." He chuckled, a low, tired sound. "I'm Mark, and clearly I'm bad at juggling." "Sarah," I replied, handing him the rolled blueprint. My eyes drifted to the title again. Structural rehabilitation. Sounds intense. He sighed, running a hand through his already messy hair. It is. This is a mess of a job. It's an old brick mill that's been abandoned for 20 years. Everyone said to tear it down, but I specialize in taking broken structures, shoring up the weaknesses, and turning them into something new. Something stronger, actually. But right now, he tapped the blueprints. It looks like all weakness. I felt a lightning bolt shoot through my chest. Structural rehabilitation. Taking broken structures and making them stronger. I looked at my own heavy envelope, the one detailing my personal rehabilitation. I couldn't help but smile. I think you and I might be doing the same kind of work, Mark, just with different materials. He tilted his head, intrigued. Oh, what materials do you work with? I held up the manuscript envelope slightly. I work with the wreckage of human experience. I write about how life's failures and losses, the things that look like they should be torn down, are actually the foundations for something better. I write about the knots in the tapestry. His expression shifted completely. The tiredness vanished, replaced by a sudden, intense recognition. The knots in the tapestry, he repeated, almost a whisper. He stepped out of the line, gesturing to the corner. You have to tell me what that means. My life, my career almost ended 3 years ago on a catastrophic failure of a bridge design. It wasn't the material, it was the calculation. It cost me everything. My firm, my reputation. They said I was finished. I spent a year fighting the urge to quit engineering forever. The only thing that got me back was the realization that I wasn't meant to build perfect new things. I was meant to fix what was broken, to find the weakness and make it the strength. I specialize in old brick because old brick, once repaired, is stronger than new steel. It has history. It has integrity. We stood there in the corner of the busy, loud post office, having the deepest, most vulnerable conversation of my life. I told him about the bakery, how I saw it as a structural failure, and how the debt, the weight, forced me to lean into my true gift, writing. I told him about the divorce, and how the necessary collapse of that old structure cleared the lot for something more authentic. He listened, his clear eyes never leaving mine, not with pity, but with profound understanding. He wasn't scared of my brokenness. He was captivated by my resilience. He understood the language of failure because he spoke it fluently. In that moment, I understood the ultimate genius of God's perfect story. My old self, the woman who tried to be a successful baker's wife, the woman who valued external success and polish, that woman would have found Mark overwhelming. She would have wanted a man with a flawless resume, a tidy background, and an easy life. She would have chased the illusion of perfection. But the new Sarah, forged in the fire of loss and rebuilt with the humility of survival, was attracted to the depth, the honesty, and the vulnerability of a man who understood the value of rehabilitation. The painful, lonely years of the desert, the divorce, the cave, they hadn't just changed me internally, they had changed my magnetism. I no longer attracted the shiny, I attracted the real. We exchanged numbers. It wasn't a whirlwind romance moment, it was a slow, intentional alignment. We went for coffee that afternoon, and we didn't talk about the weather or surface-level things. We talked about how hard it is to trust God after He lets you fall. We talked about the difference between being rejected and being redirected. And for the first time since my marriage ended, I felt seen, not despite my scars, but because of them. My past was the key that unlocked this connection. I realized then that the plot twist wasn't just the new writing career. The ultimate plot twist was the answer to my deepest, most agonizing question. Will I always be alone? God didn't give me a picture-perfect husband in a picture-perfect setting. He gave me a man who understood how much a good foundation matters, a man who saw the beauty in the process of rebuilding. He answered my loneliness with a man who could look at the ugly, knotted back of my tapestry and say, "That's beautiful. That's integrity. That's where the strength is." This divine collision solidified the lesson I had been agonizing over for months. God's timing is not slow, it is strategic. If I had met Mark 5 years earlier, I would have been too busy trying to pretend my bakery was succeeding to share my truth. He would have sensed my pretense and walked away. If I had met him 1 year earlier, I would have still been too bitter about the divorce to recognize his worth. I had to be broken down, humbled, and rebuilt as a writer who valued truth over appearance, so that I could recognize an engineer who valued integrity over newness. My failed marriage wasn't a mistake. It was the necessary end of a subplot that allowed the main love story, the one based on shared soul growth, to begin. My loneliness wasn't a punishment. It was a preparation. It was the clearing of the stage. And as I sat there, looking into Mark's deep, genuine eyes, I felt a wave of profound gratitude wash over me. I was thankful for the bankruptcy. I was thankful for the divorce. I was thankful for the dark night on the floor. I would not trade those years of agony because they led me to this moment, to this person, who was a living testament to the fact that nothing is wasted. I drove home that evening, the manuscript safely on its way, my heart soaring with a quiet, certain joy. The story was still unfolding. The journey wasn't over. But now I knew that even the most difficult chapters were leading somewhere beautiful. The final revelation was close, the summation of the entire journey. I understood that God had been writing the perfect story not for my comfort, but for my character, and that the biggest surprise was yet to come. It was a realization that went beyond Mark, beyond the book, and straight to the heart of what faith truly means. It was about seeing the final scene and trusting the author. The weeks and months that followed my meeting with Mark unfolded with a quiet, powerful grace I hadn't known was possible. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something far more satisfying. It was the unfolding of design. Mark and I didn't rush. We built our relationship brick by brick, foundation by foundation. We understood each other's history, the costly mistakes, the failures that taught us more than success ever could. He didn't try to fix me, and I didn't try to save him. We simply collaborated on two individual lives that were now flowing in the same direction. He saw the integrity of the old brick, and I saw the integrity of his rebuilt heart. Meanwhile, the book I wrote, the one born out of my most desolate night, was picked up by that small publisher, and the response was overwhelming. It wasn't a bestseller on the scale of major fiction, but it was a lifeline. Letters poured in from people who had lost their jobs, lost their children, lost their marriages, and were standing right where I had been, on the floor, staring at the knots. My pain, the one thing I had tried so desperately to hide, had become my greatest asset. My testimony was my currency. But even with the joy of Mark and the purpose of the book, there was still one black thread, one knot that seemed too ugly, too pointless to ever weave into a perfect design. The loss of Samuel, the miscarriage. That pain felt eternal, bottomless, and utterly unforgivable in the context of a perfect story. How could the death of an innocent child be part of a loving plan? This was the final and most crucial hurdle of faith. I spent many nights wrestling with this, finally able to approach the wound now that the rest of my life was stabilizing. I knew that God used the divorce, and I knew He used the bankruptcy, but the miscarriage felt like an unfair amputation. It was Mark, the structural engineer, who helped me see the final, heartbreaking truth. One evening, we were talking about a project he'd just finished, a children's hospital wing built on the site of a very old historic church that had burned down years ago. He explained to me that when they built the new wing, they discovered that the stone of the old church foundation was perfect, but the ground around it was weak and sandy. They had to dig deep, wider, and reinforce the soil, but in doing so, they created the strongest foundation possible for the new structure. He looked at me, his clear eyes serious, and said, "Sarah, sometimes the deepest foundations require the greatest sacrifice. Sometimes a space must be hollowed out, not because the space was meaningless, but because the structure that will eventually be built upon it is so important. It requires a strength that can only come from that depth of loss." That hospital wing is now saving hundreds of children's lives a year. It stands on the ground of an old tragedy, and its strength comes from that very soil. I didn't cry then. I just sat in stunned silence. The loss of Samuel hadn't been meaningless. The wound, the hole in my heart, it wasn't a barren void. It was the soil, It was the excavation necessary to create a foundation deep enough for the empathy, the vulnerability, and the ministry that was now my life's work. My ability to write with such raw, unvarnished truth, my ability to connect with Emily and countless readers, that came from knowing what true, unadulterated loss felt like. The book I wrote, the one that offered solace to thousands of grieving hearts, could only have been written by a woman who knew the smell of that sterile hospital room. The loss of my child, the life that was never meant to be, was the cost of the foundation for the thousands of lives that were now being touched by my story. It was the highest price paid, and therefore, it yielded the highest good. I realized the perfect story God was writing was not just about my happiness. It was about my usefulness. It was about redemption. The perfect story is one where the author is powerful enough to take the most devastating tragedy and incorporate it into a grand narrative of hope, turning a grave into a garden. I had spent years demanding that God write a story of ease and comfort, but He was writing a story of glory and depth. And glory always requires the cross. It requires the sacrifice. It requires the deep, dark, silent Saturday. I finally understood the title of my life. Nothing made sense. Until I realized God was writing the perfect story. The perfect story wasn't perfect because it lacked pain. It was perfect because the pain was never wasted. The perfect story is the one where the villain, my despair, my bitterness, my self-reliance, is defeated, and the hero, my true, resilient self, is revealed. It is a story of transformation, not transportation. God didn't take me out of the storm. He taught me how to fly in it. So, where are you right now? Are you in the pit with Joseph, wondering if the dream was a lie? Are you in the desert with Moses, wondering if your life's purpose has passed you by? Are you sitting in the dark, staring at your bills, your failures, and your loneliness, convinced that your narrative is over? I want to tell you, as a fellow traveler who has reached the next chapter, you are in the middle. You are in the part of the book where the tension is highest, where the hero is learning the vital skills needed for the climax. You are not rejected. You are being refined. You are not forgotten. You are being prepared. Stop trying to grab the pen. Stop critiquing the current chapter. The weaver is at the loom, and he does not make mistakes. Your bankruptcy is a skill-building course. Your heartbreak is an empathy workshop. Your loneliness is a sacred silence where you can finally hear your own true voice and his. Every knot is intentional. Every frayed thread is known. You are looking at the back of the tapestry, and yes, it is a mess of dark, clashing colors. But the story on the front, the masterpiece he is weaving with your resilience, your wisdom, and your hard-won peace, is going to be breathtaking. It is going to be a light for every other struggling soul who walks into the room. Surrender the pen today. Close your eyes and whisper to the quiet, I trust you with the ending, because the plot twist is coming, and it will be so perfectly timed, so exquisitely aligned with the pain you endured, that you will look back at your darkest night and realize that God wasn't ignoring you. He was simply setting the stage for the most glorious, most impactful, most perfectly written story you could ever imagine. And trust me, the climax is worth the wait.